So, welcome back, Random Theology. I want to continue with my paper, God with Us, Christian Complex Theism. I gave the abstract and we discussed methodological rationalism, metaphysical foundationalism. We discussed metaphysical coherentism, and we discussed the creator-creature distinction. I'd like to pick up on divine immutability. So, in this section of my paper, I make some distinctions that may clarify. So, there's a distinction between essential and accidental properties, and this goes back even to medieval theologians. An essential property is a defining feature of a substance. And an example would be an essential property of a cheeseburger is cheese, right? Or an essential property of a triangle is 3 sides. An accidental property is a non-essential feature of a substance as either an extraneous accident or a proper accident. An extraneous accidental property is contingent. It is a contingent non-essential property, while a proper accident is a necessary non-essential property. So for an accidental property, that's clear. It's not essential to a substance, right? And then a further distinction between a contingent accidental property or a necessary accidental property can be made. But an accidental property is a non-essential feature of a substance. A further distinction may be made between uncreated and created properties. Uncreated properties necessarily exist without a metaphysical or temporal beginning. Created properties contingently exist with a metaphysical or temporal beginning. So what would be an uncreated property? Well, for a Christian Platonist can say an uncreated property could be goodness, right? And it would be a property that would not be in Plato's heaven. Rather, it would be, for a Christian Platonist, a property would be either possessed or produced by God. And so there is never a property that is not either possessed or produced by God. And so there isn't like properties floating out in the universe, uncreated properties floating out in the universe. That's an impossibility for Christian Platonism. So uncreated properties would be properties that would be like goodness, or maybe we could say, I think goodness is enough, because for the Christian Platonists, what they want to say is goodness is an essential uncreated property of God. And then what would be a created property? Well, God being the creator, right? That would be an example of a created property. God being creator. When God creates, he acquires an accidental property of being the creator. And that relationship of God to his creation, it is a created relation. And so that would be a property. God being, creatorhood would be the property. So that would be an example of a created property. And then a final distinction is between divine and non-divine properties. Divine properties are specific properties, whether uncreated or created, that are necessarily or contingently, so we have modality here, possessed, and we could think of possessed as an asymmetrical relation, or it could be symmetrical, given the coherent metaphysical coherentism that I've discussed. But it is a property, whether it be uncreated or created, that is necessarily or contingently possessed, asymmetrically or symmetrically related, and united, think of like fusion bond, to the divine substance, consistent with all divine properties. So right now I'm defining a divine property. Let me once again go over this because I think I convoluted or confused the distinction here. So the distinction is between divine and non-divine properties. And so we're going to focus on divine properties first. Divine properties are specific properties, whether uncreated or created, necessarily or contingently, possessed, asymmetrically related, and united, that is to say, a fusion bond, to the divine substance, consistent with all divine perfections and properties. So that would be a definition of a divine property. A non-divine property. So non-divine properties are specific created properties, necessarily or contingently possessed, asymmetrically related by a non-divine substance, consistent with all non-divine properties. So there's the distinction between created and uncreated properties, and a distinction between divine and non-divine properties. So putting it all together. So God's essential nature, and so before we move forward, I want to make some points here. So thinking about these distinctions here that I've laid out, I think that we can discuss a few things here. So first, some of this material I'm getting from Ross Inman, J. Wesley Richards. Okay. And I'm thinking through it. And so what I want to say at this juncture is I want to say that some of this relates to the incarnation. And I think that maybe we need to discuss that here in a moment. So let's discuss immutability directly. So some of these distinctions are going to help us not only with the creator-creature distinction, but also immutability. So God's essential nature and moral character is immutable. It's unchanging. Yet God may be mutable insofar as God can actively and voluntarily undergo intrinsic and extrinsic change consistent with God's essential nature. God can acquire accidental properties. God can voluntarily undergo emotional changes of anger or suffering, that is to say, mental anguish, consistent with God's essential nature and character in response to God's free creature's actions. And notice this is all voluntary. So this is not passive. God is receiving, right? No. God is actively involved in this. So there is no receiving without God actually be the one that is orchestrating all this, and God is actively involved in it. So God is not acted upon involuntarily, right? Or non-voluntarily. And I don't have my notes here, but Richard Creel has an interesting distinction about God being emotionally touched, but God is not emotionally crushed. And I think that's applicable here. I think that that's right. So this is related to, so immutability is related to impassibility, and you'll see this. And some of the work that I am leveraging on here is going to be Bruce Ware, K. Scott Oliphant, and I look at Ronnie Kurtz's article, denying divine changelessness, a taxonomy of deviations and denials of divine immutability. I continue here. God can voluntarily enter into contingent dependence relations without becoming necessarily mutably dependent. It's very important, the modalities here, and understanding the type of dependence I'm talking about here is non-essential, and that is contingent. Right? It's not essential, and it is not necessary. But God can enter into a dependence relationship. And perhaps you would want an example. Well, I think the primary example is when God creates the world, God may become dependent upon the world to be the creator. God acquires the accidental property of creatorship, right? God becomes the creator subsequent to creating. And that is, in my view, not merely an extrinsic property, but it is intrinsic, because God is actively doing something that he is not eternally, God is not eternally creating the universe, right? And if God is not eternally creating the universe, and that the universe has a definite beginning, that God was not always creating, God was solitary as a triune being, and then God at T1 creates the universe, at time 1 creates the universe, then God becomes the creator at T1, at the moment of creation. And it is in virtue of God exercising his creativity, creating, right? Actualizing the universe. And in that sense, God is dependent upon his creation. And that dependence is non-essential, and it is voluntary, and it is contingent. And I continue here. God acquires the accidental property of creatorhood. That's one example. Another is, or as God creates free creatures that sin, God may actively and voluntarily undergo emotional changes of happiness to wrath, consistent with God's immutable essential nature and character. God will exercise justice in the form of wrath against sin in his created universe of free creatures. If God acquires accidental properties, it does not mutate nor change God's essential nature and essential properties. God acquiring an accidental property does not make God a creature, precisely because a creature is a created substance, not merely a created property. This is very important to understand. So I have a footnote here. I have a few different footnotes, so I want to go into some of these. So footnote 43, the property owners of a substance would have to be created to count as a creature. So in other words, God is a subject, and since we believe God is triune, we would say that God as subjects, or God as property bearers, those subjects or property bearers would have to be created in order for God to count as a creature, right? Because a creature, in the way that I define it, is the property owner, or we could say the subject of the substance is created. The property owner is created. So if God acquires accidental properties, that does not make God a creature, because a creature, properly defined, is not only has created properties, but is a created subject or a created property bearer. And God is not a created property bearer. God is not a created subject. And so it would be incorrect to call the view that I'm articulating here to be able to label God a creature or to say that this creates idolatry. That would be improper on my view, because on my view, that's impossible. And this applies to the incarnation. This goes into the Nestorian controversy, why it's important to believe and affirm that Jesus has two distinct natures. And the reason why Jesus's human nature is truly human is because there is a created property, there's a created property bearer, right? And we could say that there's a created property owner as well. But it just so happens that God, the Son, because of the incarnation, the hypostatic union is such that the divine Son takes up the created property owner, right? And so the created property owner is not a person, right? Instead, we have the divine Son with a human body and a rational soul or rational mind, and that rational soul is not a person because of the incarnation itself. And so when I'm thinking about even the incarnation here, I think Thomas Morris and Oliver Crisp and Tim Paul's work helps me to see that, and even Stephen J. Wellum, that it would make sense if you have a two mind or two consciousness, or we could even say Luke Stamps here, if we have a two mind or two consciousness model of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, that is like a compositional model, it would make sense of why you would want to have the human nature of Jesus, or I should say the human nature in the incarnation that Jesus assumes, that it would be a creature, because it would be a human nature, a human body with a rational soul, and that rational soul would not be a unique human being, or I shouldn't say unique, I should say would not be a unique human person because of the incarnation. Jesus assumes that human nature, that human body, and that rational soul, and it is him behind the rational soul. And the analogy that's typically given is you could think of a video game programmer. A video game programmer or a video game creator, he can create multiple characters in the game, and he can create a specific character that is his avatar, right, in the game, and program everything that specific character in the game does, and yet behind that character is the creator of the game itself, right? And this is an imperfect analogy, but what it translates to meaning is that the identity, there's only one subject or one personal identity in the incarnation, and that is going to be the divine Son. And yet there's a human I, and there's the divine I, and yet behind the human I, the individual, is the divine individual, right? And when we say human individual, we have to be very careful, because people are going to automatically think, well then, doesn't that mean that the human individual that walked around in Galilee and Nazareth, isn't he a distinct person than the divine Son? And what we're saying is, well, no, because the divine Son is the one created that specific personal identity, that human identity that people are encountering, and it's him behind it. That there is no other individual. It is the divine Son through the human nature. And there's not another individual. It is similar to the example that I gave about the video gamer. And I brought that up just a thought that's outside of my notes here, that it may apply to the incarnation. And it, and maybe you don't, those that are listening in, you might not enjoy any of the things that I've said here. And so maybe you might want to scrap this idea of the incarnation, and that's fine. You can always follow Andrew Loke or Richard Swinburne or William Lane Craig, but I found that to be interesting. All right, continuing on in my notes here. So I made all these distinctions about that are, I shouldn't say about, but apply to immutability. I talked about a dependence relation that is non-essential and that is voluntary and that is contingent. And I want to say this, that God acquiring an accidental property does not make God a creature, precisely because a creature is a created substance, not merely a created property. God may voluntarily express essential properties through accidental properties in a specific way that is neither for the better nor worse, that neither improves nor updates, neither develops nor diminishes God's essential nature and essential properties. Continuing. When God creates, God intentionally exercises an intrinsic power, namely creativity. God gains an accidental property of creator. God merely exercises God's essential attributes. We can think of omnipotence. The accidental property of creator depends on God's essential properties of creativity and omnipotence. And perhaps it is better to say God's intrinsic disposition of creativity becomes occurrent as creator. So God's occurrent property of creator is merely an expression of God's dispositional property as creative. It may be argued that God must not, so here we're switching over to talk about God being as actus purus. So it may be argued that God must not have active and passive potential. If God has passive potential, then God must be incomplete or imperfect, given the assumptions of some theologians, like Thomas Aquinas. But this is a non sequitur. There can be value-neutral passive potential that is neither for the better nor worse. This is precisely the intuitions of certain theodicies against Leibniz for why the actual world is not necessarily the greatest of all possible worlds. There can be value-neutral changes that are neither for the best, that are neither better nor worse. So change in and of itself is neither perfect or imperfect. It could be value neutral. And so the idea of God acquiring accidental properties does not deny God's perfection. In fact, it would affirm God's essential properties. Because if we're saying that God can acquire accidental properties, it's not going to change God's essential properties. Instead, it's just God exercising essential properties to acquire accidental properties. I hope that's helpful. because they think that if God changes in any way, shape, or form, then God ceases to be perfect. And with the distinction of essential properties and non-essential or accidental properties, we can show that change is not necessarily an imperfection. So we can deny the Platonic principle that all change is either for the better or for the worst. That's not necessarily true. Now we can move on and talk a little bit about the doctrine of the Trinity. So on the first version of Christian complex theism that I discussed, which I labeled metaphysical foundationalism. So on the first version of Christian complex theism as metaphysical foundationalism, God as triune yields auxiliary constituents of the real essential definition of God. So here is a proposed real definition of God as triune. God as triune may be defined: God is three distinct and co-equal persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, whose divinity and unity are explained, whose divinity and unity are explained by essential dependence. Each person of the Trinity possesses together numerically distinct divine properties, reflecting their individual essence, yet they remain one in their general essence, i.e., the homoousios nature that they share, and in the expression of the divine nature, the homoousios nature that they share. Or the divine persons are constituted by the divine nature in a single trope of divinity. Thinking of William Hasker here. Insofar as God cannot create a square circle, nor can God be more or less than three persons, God cannot be nor do that which is contrary to who and what God is. I have a footnote here. Person is minimally a subject with a first-person perspective. So think of Lynn Rudder Baker's discussion of first-person perspective. A person may further be construed as a part or a modification of a substance. If counting by division in terms of substances, then there is exactly one divine substance. If counting by divine properties, there are multiple properties for complex theism. If counting by divine property bearers, there's exactly three divine property bearers or subjects, but not three divine substances or gods. Christians count God by substance, not by parts or properties of a substance. So this is important for our Muslim friends to understand. Christians count by substance, because they seem to conflate person with substance. And I find this humorous because there's different Islamic schools, and some of the schools they advocate some form of complex theism. And so they believe in numerically distinct divine attributes, and yet they want to label Trinitarians as polytheists. So this is, obviously that's absurd, because Trinitarians are a type of monotheists. But be that as it may, this hopefully will help clarify some misunderstandings from our Muslim Islamic friends. So here I might get some pushback, but it's okay. Here I believe Trinitarians should affirm the divine processions for greater explanatory power and scope. Ironically, those who deny the divine processions are in the same position as those who affirm divine simplicity as numerical identity. Both denying the processions and affirming divine simplicity as identity are explanatorily non-starters. Both prematurely and unnecessarily block any further explanation. Those who affirm divine simplicity as identity prematurely terminate all explanation in the inexplicable, simple divine nature. Likewise, those who deny the divine processions assert that the divine persons are primitive without any further explanation as to the nature of the personal distinctions. And here I have footnoted one of William Lane Craig's articles where he denies the divine processions, and he tries to critique Mark Macon. I think that we should affirm the divine processions. And I go further here. I say Trinitarians that affirm the divine processions must concede there is a necessary taxis, order or structure intrinsic to God, in which the Father begets the Son, and through the Son, the Father and the Son spirates the Holy Spirit. In my judgment, the best account of the divine processions is Mark Macon's essential dependence model. Although Joshua Sijuati's ontological grounding model has merit. Of course, any structure entails complexity, which divine simplicity as identity denies. Which I find that very odd, because on all views of the divine processions, there is a taxis, there's an order or structure intrinsic to God. And so in my mind, that automatically disqualifies divine simplicity as numerical identity. But I will let those that affirm divine simplicity try to show that that is compatible with the divine processions. Continuing on. Now, how do we individuate the divine persons? Well, I've already talked about the divine processions, but I go into this paper just, in some sense, writing down some thoughts I have about individuation. So I ask the question, are the divine persons extramentally distinct of the divine substance? If not, so in other words, can you say that there's an individual essence and a general essence? Because I think we should be able to say that. And I'm using Aristotelian distinctions here. So for those that are unfamiliar with that, don't misinterpret what I'm saying to think that I'm saying that there's multiple substances here. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's one substance and that there's these two levels of distinction between an individual essence and a general essence. And yet we're talking about only one substance here. Let me continue. So if we can't make a distinction between the persons and the substance, then the procession relations, think of generation and spiration, are not ontologically distinct, in which case there are no ontic grounds for individuation. I see relations or modes, so modifications of the substance, can individuate, but they individuate very thinly. I don't think you get this robust notion of person. Given simplicity as numerical identity, I just don't, I know that those that affirm divine simplicity truly affirm the Trinity, but it seems by my lights, it entails modalism, because divine simplicity doesn't have the metaphysical resources to be able to account for the three divine persons as persons. It thinly individuates the divine persons to the point where they are modes similar to like the modalists or Sabellianists would affirm. And I'm not saying that Thomas Aquinas and followers of Thomas Aquinas are modalists. They're not. They affirm the doctrine of the Trinity. But what I'm saying is their metaphysics, I don't think it's robust enough to individuate the divine persons in which they are endowed with personhood. And so I continue. Trinitarian divine cognition and knowledge seems to contradict divine simplicity as numerical identity. The divine persons of the Trinity seem to have distinct self-knowledge, de re beliefs, or mental tokens, perhaps better characterized as a first-person perspective. And that is unaccounted for by divine simplicity as numerical identity. The best account that someone could propose is Scott Williams' model, his social Latin model, in which he proposes that the three divine persons share a single mental token. This is an interesting idea. I think it's worth exploring more. But I have a hard time thinking. I have a really hard time squaring that with how the three persons can have distinct de re beliefs and yet share one single mental token, where the Father thinks I am the Father, and the Son thinks I am the Father, and the Holy Spirit thinks I am the Father, but somehow all three of the persons take that single mental token and are able to have distinct self-knowledge from it. It just doesn't seem enough to me, but I'm willing to explore that further. So I appreciate Scott Williams, his proposal. Continuing on, is God the divine persons, the three divine persons, or the divine substance? Now we're asking, what is the referent God? Is it an identity referent? Is it a predicate referent? Is it constitution referent? What is it? Is God properly numerically identical to the divine substance of the three divine persons, or is God numerically identical to the three divine persons of the divine substance? Often the latter is specified as God is the Father, eternally begetting the Son, and through the Son, spirating the Spirit. All three divine persons are essential to the definition of God as a concrete divine substance. For us Trinitarians, that is definitionally what we must affirm, that all three divine persons are essential to the definition of God as a concrete divine substance. If this is the case, then the logical problem of the Trinity must be solved with divine simplicity. But divine simplicity, in my view, compounds the logical problem of the Trinity, not solve it. And this is why usually those that affirm divine simplicity, they will resort to Mysterianism because they cannot resolve the logical problem. And so they will resort to appealing to divine incomprehensibility, divine inscrutability, divine ineffability. And that's not what we need. There is a point where it is rational, and it is rational to appeal to mystery. Okay, but I think that it's too early to do that. And so here I think we should attempt to solve it. If the divine substance is both concrete and numerically identical to the three divine substances or persons, and the three divine substances, I'm using the Latin terms and it's confusing me. So let me start again. If the divine substance is both concrete and numerically identical to the three divine subsistences or persons, and the three divine subsistences or persons are numerically identical to the divine substance, yet a divine subsistence or person is not numerically identical to the three divine subsistences or persons, and a divine subsistence or person is not numerically identical to the three divine subsistences or persons, then a divine subsistence or person is not numerically identical to the divine substance. So just working out the logical problem of the Trinity, let's make it even more simpler. We can pose this as a dilemma. Is the Father all of who and what God is exhaustively? If you say yes, then you deny the Trinity. If you say no, then you deny divine simplicity as numerical identity. The point is, a concrete divine person or subsistence or mode is not the whole divine Trinity. The three subsistences, the three divine persons, right? And that gets at the heart of the logical problem of the Trinity. And that is why I don't discuss it here, but we are equivocating when we use the term is. Because we can use it in three different senses. We can use it in terms of identity, we can use it in terms of predication, and then we can also use it in terms of constitution. And there might be other ways as well. And this is why it's very important for us to properly define what we are trying to argue. Excuse me. So I pray that my paper, which is accessible, look at the video description, and it is there. So what can we make of my paper? That we need to have think of my paper as just trying to broadening our horizons or the contours of the Christian worldview. That we are not pigeonholed to only understanding Christian theology and Christian philosophy in one way. That the Christian tradition has a broad, a narrow and a broad traditional streams that we can tap into. And so we do not have to be caged to one tradition. And I feel like over the last 5 or 6 years, the Christian academic scene has become, it has become an unhealthy form of cancel culture. That if you don't affirm Thomas Aquinas or some form of Thomism, then you are outcast. You are excluded from sitting at the table among the Christian scholars. Now that's not true at the Evangelical Theological Society, ETS, or the Evangelical Philosophical Society, EPS. That's not true there, but when it comes to book deals and when it comes to presentations, if you're not affirming a particular view that's currently trending, then you're not going to get a call back. You're not going to go on, you're not going to be requested to teach at a seminary. You're not going to be requested to go to a church and do presentations. You're essentially blacklisted. And that should not be the case among Christian scholars. We should be willing to engage in arguments. On Twitter, I made the point that we should We should not cancel each other. Instead, we should critique each other. Critique, do not cancel. And that should be our hearts as Christians, especially those of us that are specialized in areas that a lot of the laity are not going to want to. They have no specialization in what we're focused on, and it's unhelpful, because to them, the laity, they're looking at all of us Christian scholars that are critiquing each other or canceling each other, and they are confused. Why is this happening? And what are some examples of this? I'll give you some concrete examples. I'm not going to just speak in blanket statements, right? No, I'm going to not be general. I'm going to be particular here. I know that this has happened to John Frame. John Frame's systematic theology, consistently people do not recommend it because they say that he denies that he is heretical. And that is a bold-faced lie. Or Dr. Bruce Ware. He is another one. Because he affirms eternal functional subordination, people say that he is heretical as Ware, which is another bold-faced lie. I can demonstrate that eternal functional subordination does not entail heresy. Watch my video that I responded to Mike Riccardi. Or they critique K. Scott Oliphant, and they it's almost like it was like the Van Til Gordon Clark controversy all over again. They tried to get Jeffrey Waddington and all these other guys tried to get Dr. Oliphant, Lane Tipton, and all those guys tried to get him ousted at Westminster Seminary. Again, and Dr. Oliphant, they even got his book, God with Us. They bought the rights and basically torched the book. And in my view, his doctrine of God, it can be consistent and it can be faithful to Scripture. I'm not saying I agree with everything that Dr. Oliphant taught, but I think that there's a way to take what he says, and I don't see, he should not have been canceled. And them going through the court proceedings through the Presbyterian Church, that was unnecessary. But the constant attacks of calling each other heretics and blacklisting them, that's wrong. I'm trying to think of some other people that have been blacklisted. Probably John S. Feinberg as well. But I don't know that with certainty, but it happens, right? And I think that is absurd. That happened to Gordon H. Clark. That should have never happened. If you're interested in that controversy, there's a book by his biography. You can read about the charges that were brought before the presbytery for him. But we need to critique each other, not cancel each other. So I hope anything that I said is helpful. Read my paper if anything that I said is unclear or doesn't make any sense. And feel free to comment on this video and reach out to me. I'm always interested to explore ideas further. And just to show you my good faith, I posted this paper to Jared Mitchelson, and he's an up-and-coming scholar that I think, he disagrees. He's going to disagree with everything I said, but he is an interesting guy, and he wrote a paper. I did cite it. It's brand new, hot off the press. But, he was kind. He obviously just skimmed what I wrote, but he made a good point that we need to explore all the different traditions and all the different traditions And it's good to explore these different ideas. It's good. Even if you may disagree with what I have to say, look at the scholarship. And I pray that you guys have a happy new year as the new year approaches. Right now it's still 2025, but 2026 is here. It's almost here. Peace and God bless.